If you're a kid from the 90s, you remember Robin Williams. You'll remember him as the genie from Aladdin. And also, the movie Hook was probably getting played a lot on your VCR as well. You'll also remember one of the biggest live-action family comedies of the entire 90s decade, Mrs. Doubtfire. It made an absurd $441 million worldwide in 1993. 1993 was the year of Jurassic Park, but also Mrs. Doubtfire. One had groundbreaking CGI, and the other had a groundbreaking comedic performance. I have a question. What does it mean when an actor makes a role their own? It's easy to credit the success of Mrs. Doubtfire solely to Robin Williams' overall acting chops. His whip-smart timing and warmth are a genuinely good reason for doing so. But it goes deeper than that. What made Robin take this role on? How did he infuse the story with a truth that was so personal and so a part of his DNA that this movie literally couldn't have been made with anyone else in the role? And who was the secret weapon behind the scenes who nurtured the movie right up to its release? Well, sit back, relax, swallow an entire spicy shrimp whole, and let's take a dive into the true story behind Mrs. Doubtfire. The origins of Mrs. Doubtfire can be traced back to a children's book called Alias Madame Doubtfire, written by English author Anne Fine. It's about Miranda and Daniel, a couple who have gone through a bitter divorce. The husband, Daniel Hillard, is an out-of-work actor, and when Miranda is in search of a nanny, Daniel disguises himself as a woman to get the job and to spend more time with his children. You know, the same plot as the movie. The book came under the radar of Marcia Garces Williams, who was not only the producer of the film adaptation of Mrs. Doubtfire, but also Robin Williams' second wife. She was originally employed by Robin and his first wife, Valerie, to be the nanny for their son, Zachary. That was in 1984. After that, Marcia went on to become Williams' assistant on Good Morning Vietnam in 1987. By 1989, Marcia and Robin were married. She continued working as his assistant on the films Dead Poet Society, The Fisher King, Hook, and Toys. It's after this that she put on her producer hat and started working on the biggest live-action hit of Williams' career. In a featurette for Mrs. Doubtfire called From Man to Mrs., The Evolution of Mrs. Doubtfire, Marcia says this about the project. I like the idea that a man would have to play a woman and do it well enough to pass. I looked at things at that point more in terms of the range that it would require of Robin as an actor. And I figured, we could make the rest work around that. I mean, I was just purely interested in the idea of Robin playing this woman more than anything. Marcia and Robin had been monitoring the progress of the script throughout its development. Once Chris Columbus jumped on board and added his screenwriting talent to the project, Robin Williams grew more intrigued. Chris Columbus had started his career as a screenwriter. You're probably aware of at least a few of his movies: Gremlins, Gremlins 2, Adventures in Babysitting, and The Goonies. There's many more, but those were the movies he had written before his directing career really took off. In 1990, Columbus directed the gigantic mega hit Home Alone. And right before Mrs. Doubtfire, he was coming off of Home Alone 2, another huge hit in the books. So it must have felt like a good omen for Robin and Marcia when Columbus became attached to Mrs. Doubtfire as its director. Columbus eventually got the script to a place where Robin felt confident in its hilarious, heartwarming, and realistic tone. As realistic as it could be, considering the subject matter, that is. Now, Robin Williams was ready to dive in head first. You know how actors sometimes say they really became the role? Well, Robin Williams was the role. So much of his real life was harnessed and put on display in this movie, and it's the reason only he could have pulled it off. First of all, he could relate to the divorce aspect. As mentioned earlier, he ended up marrying his son's former nanny. This was after going through the final divorce with his ex-wife Valerie Velarde. From that point on, it was a priority for Robin to be heavily involved in Zachary's life and to not let the divorce drive a wedge between he and his son. Very quickly, his second wife, Marcia, became an integral part of Robin's career, not only producing Mrs. Doubtfire, but also Patch Adams and Jacob the Liar. I think this was their way of staying close together throughout Robin's megastardom. It can't be ignored that Marcia had previously been a nanny, let alone the nanny of Robin's child. I'm sure that had an influence on her when choosing Mrs. Doubtfire as their next project. During the early years of her marriage with Robin, Marcia was navigating her way around being a new mother figure for Zachary, as well as her two other children with Robin, Zelda and Cody. All of these personal developments going on behind the scenes caused the Williams to push for Daniel and Miranda to remain divorced at the end of the film. Originally, the studio wanted the parents to get back together, but Robin and Marcia both felt strongly that this would not display the reality of divorce and would give young audiences a false hope. 17 years later, the couple ended up divorced in 2010. At the beginning of Mrs. Doubtfire, Daniel Hillard leaves his job as a voice actor due to his strong personal beliefs being violated. Well, this was something Robin could relate to deeply. Just 1 year prior, Robin had his biggest hit to date with the animated Disney film Aladdin. He agreed to join the animation at a scale much lower than his usual pay, which ended up being around $75,000 total. His only demands were that the studio wouldn't use his physical appearance in the advertising or overuse the genie character to sell merchandise like Happy Meals and Burger King toys. However, they did significantly bump up the genie character in their marketing, although it was supposedly done within the boundaries of the contract Robin signed. It left a bad taste in his mouth, and while promoting Mrs. Doubtfire, he spoke out about his distaste for what Disney had done. He said he wouldn't work for the House of Mouse again. To cool things off, the CEO of Disney at that time, Jeffrey Katzenberg, sent over a Picasso as a peace offering. Robin wasn't impressed. Although I would have been, those things go for buku bucks. In the direct-to-video sequel, Return of Jafar, the genie role was taken over by Dan Castellaneta, more famously known as the voice of Homer Simpson. It wasn't until Aladdin and the King of Thieves that Robin returned to the role of the genie, and that was only after Jeffrey Katzenberg left his position as CEO of Disney and Joe Roth took over. Roth earned Williams' respect by giving a public apology to the actor for past wrongdoings. And just like that, he and Mickey Mouse were friends once again. Now we cut to the opening scene of Mrs. Doubtfire. Daniel Hillard quits his job because the cartoon he's voicing starts smoking a cigarette. This was just like Robin in real life. He would stand up for what he feels is right, regardless of the money that was at stake. Something we can all agree on is that Robin Williams was an actor that really went for it, you know? I mean, you could never accuse him of giving anything less than 100% in his roles. To play a man who would do anything to be with his children, even dressing up as an old woman and pretending to be their nanny, that takes commitment. A commitment that Williams most definitely had in real life. In fact, 2 years after Mrs. Doubtfire came out, he found himself dressing up as a Russian doctor and sneaking into a hospital to bring levity to his dear friend who had just become paralyzed from a horseback riding incident. That friend was former Superman Christopher Reeve. The two had attended Juilliard together in the 70s and had been good buddies ever since. Robin burst into Reeve's hospital room and demanded that he turn over, which was strange to Reeve, who was obviously unable to do so. Christopher was about to call for a nurse when he recognized the madman as Robin Williams. He had a good laugh and admitted that it was the first time he had done so since his accident. Robin Williams, a man who was always willing to go the distance for those he loved. And that's one of the reasons why playing Mrs. Doubtfire was so easy to accept in his hands. On a side note, Williams went on to play a character just like the one he played for Reeve in Chris Columbus's movie 9 Months. Crazy stuff. Another instance of art imitating life. Look, Mrs. Doubtfire is a classic movie. It's still funny to this day. It still has loads of heart that takes the material to the next level, and you can forever see the unrivaled talent bursting through Robin Williams. He's someone who didn't hesitate to give all of himself to a role. When he passed away in 2014, we lost a legendary spirit. However, he lives on through his legacy, and for that, we should all be grateful. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give the like and subscribe buttons a few light slams. It would really help my channel because I want you in the worst way. See you next time.